Ho ho ho, it's the Gamers Christmas! E3 and I'm the Game and SEAHORSE! Pop, 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 pop. Another E3 goes by and another wish goes unfulfilled. I wish for a new James Pond game and I ended up with a new Bubsy game. Guess that's how life goes sometimes. So many games and so many developers and so much spin out there. Just so hard for an up-and-coming SEAHORSE journalist like myself to keep up with what's going on between our digital avatar's legs. Feminist Frequency's been keeping track over the years of what kind of genders are being represented in our video games, whether or not you can play a boy or a girl or a not applicable. This year, more featured games than ever before allow players to either choose from a pre-existing assortment of characters of varied genders or create their own. In fact, over half of all games featured at the press conference, 58 out of 109, fall into the categories of games in which you do not play exclusively or primarily as a specific male or female protagonist. So you're saying 58 games out of 109 allows you to select whatever gender you want. Well, okay then, I guess problem solved. Good job, Feminist Frequency. You know, I was always a fan of yours and I'm not afraid of you. You scared all those white male developers onto your side and now they're gonna give you everything you want on a silver platter. Our not applicable category accounts for both games in which you can play as a character of an unspecified gender, such as Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and those games in which you essentially play as vehicles or other objects, such as Rocket League and Robocraft Infinity. Well, thank you for taking account of Robocraft Infinity, because we were all wanting to know what kind of penis and or vagina our characters may or may not have. Oh, thank God, there's a visual that I can show. So according to this, 52%, or shall I say a majority of all games featured, allow you to have a multiple selection so you can choose a gender. Only 7% are specifically female protagonists, 26% are male-only protagonists, and 15% are not applicable. So if I'm reading this right, they would be happy that 59%, if you add the female and the multi, that means 59% of all games shown were female or had the choice of being a female, while 15% it doesn't matter because you might be a robot with no junk. Only 26% of males are represented here. Well, that seems pretty good. It seems like there's more equal representation in video games. I mean, are you happy? Do we have to keep track anymore, or is this not good enough? Do we need the male slice of the pie to be less than a quarter? The way I'm looking at this chart, it looks like over half all the games out there, you can be what you want to be, except for the 15%. You gotta be a robot. And only 7% are forced female. I still don't understand what they're trying to chart here, so let's read the follow-up here. We appreciate and commend those games that featured female characters and players in their E3 demos. Anthem, for instance, is a game in which players can determine the gender of the character. Oh, okay. Well, been around forever, almost every multiplayer game, but the demo centered on a female character and female player. Presentations like this help normalize the presence of women in both online and physical gaming spaces. Compared to last year, in which 12 times as many games featured male characters as female heroes, this would be a very good year. Okay, glad you're happy. Glad we could put this to rest. But the very fact that a year in which the number of games featuring men only outstrips those featuring women by a factor of 3.5 instead of a factor of 12 qualifies as a good year is itself tremendously damning, revealing that there is still so far to go before we come anywhere close to achieving gender equality in gaming representations. Where does it end? What's the specific number? Do you want 1-to-1 every single game? 1-to-1. Male, female, universal pronoun labels, no genders? If you painted that pie graph completely purple, would you be happy? Games that give us defined female heroes continue to be essential, in part because we live in a culture that regularly encourages girls and women to project themselves onto and fully empathize with male characters, but rarely encourages boys and men to fully project themselves onto female characters. When players are encouraged to see a game universe exclusively through the eyes of a humanized female character, it helps to challenge the idea that men can't or shouldn't identify with women as full human beings. I'm looking at this research, I guess, and I'm not seeing any footnotes that link me to any studies that tell me whether or not being able to project your male self onto a female avatar is a positive thing, or concretely affirms that boys are able to humanize females. They weren't able to humanize females before, but then they play Metroid, and then they are able to humanize females because they were able to shoot Metroids as a female. So I'm not seeing that there's any sort of link or study or really any reason to collect this data, but it's there, and you got more representation than ever before, but it's just bad that you had to have any representation, I guess. So shame on you, developers, for giving us what we wanted. Now, if the gender issue wasn't a strange metric to measure for, we're gonna get a little Jack Thompson on you, we're going old school, Joseph Lieberman. Here we go. On combat, this year, as was the case last year, over 80% of the games featured at E3 utilize violence as a gameplay mechanic. We have given the benefit of the doubt to card games such as Fable Fortune and Shadowverse, in which the action clearly represents a battle, reasoning that they also simulate two people sitting across a table playing cards with each other. Okay. Thanks for the clarification there, Carolyn. If we hadn't done this, the percentage of non-violent games would have been even lower. Okay, so Hearthstone would fall into non-combat, right? I just want to know, does Minecraft fall into non-combat? Because you don't have to fight anything to play that game. It's optional. It should be combat, non-combat, optional combat should be represented here, because you can play through Deus Ex being a pacifist for the most part. Out of 109 games measured, 17% non-combat, 83% combat. So why would combat games be more representative than non-combat? Could it be because they sell? You've captured my interest. I'm going to look at the top 10 best-selling games of 2016, and we're going to get to the bottom of this and figure out why more games that involve combat were represented at E3. What do we all have in common with the top 10 best-selling games? Seems like people, when they want to escape into their digital realms, might want to shoot a bad guy or two. Can you tell me why that's negative? Okay, as with our numbers on gender, it is important to understand that this data isn't meant to suggest that every game that employs combat mechanics is bad. Then what? If it's not bad, then why take the data? Additionally, we are in no way equating all games that employ violent mechanics with each other. The data isn't intended to suggest that the colorful sword swinging of Tunic is the equivalent of the brutal beheadings that we may see in Middle-earth: Shadow of War. Okay, so some combat is okay, and other combat is gruesome. I just don't understand. Why measure it? Rather, we present the data to call attention to how prevalent violence remains in games of all kinds. Because when violence is so consistently seen as a core component of game design, it limits our sense of what games are capable of and what kinds of stories they can tell. Well, you know, I kind of see their point there. They want more original mechanics in games. Maybe not everything should have violence in it. Okay, that's a fair argument to make. I'll give them that, but it seems like you took this down to paint violence as a negative core component of video games, something that shouldn't exist. Okay, so you've shown us that there's combat in games. You've not provided any sort of alternatives or made any sort of suggestions on what we should play if we cannot play our combat games. What games would you suggest? What are the ones that are okay and that will help reinforce more positivity and non-violence in our video games and influence positive things? Because your research doesn't suggest that combat should be seen as a negative thing, or violence should be seen as a negative thing in video games, because there's no research, there's no footnote, there's no alternative suggestions on what we should play. So if they're not going to use all the money and do the work, then I'm going to do it. Here's a solution. You want games to change, then make a game with no combat. So here's my pitch. You play as a genderless protagonist, perhaps a seahorse. There's an evil doctor called Dr. Maybe. He's overtaken the ruthless mega corporation known as the Acme Oil Company, and he's filling the oceans with radiation and toxic waste. And you gotta take your anthropomorphic, intelligent, mutant seahorse, call him the gaming seahorse, and make that game a spoof of a James Bond movie. And we'll call it James Pond, ; the gaming seahorse is the new James Pond. And it's gonna have storytelling and an emotional arc inside of there. We're gonna all play some card games in it, and I'm gonna choose the one with the fish on it because that's my favorite deck, but I'm going dark blue. There's gonna be a gender slider in it. What more could you want? That's a $10 billion idea and I just gave it away for free. What? Oh, you feel like my idea's a waste of time? Well, now we're even.